So when you first take the plunge into collecting watches, all the terminology and information you need to pick up on can be a little bit daunting. So how do you make sense of all of that? What's up, guys? Hope you guys have all been well and staying safe. Welcome back to another video. Just a quick note, if you haven't already, please leave me a like and subscribe down below. It helps me out a ton, and join the TWM army for your regular watch content. Now, on that note, this video is going to be aimed at the absolute beginner. It's come to my attention that not everybody is fully aware of the terminology that's thrown around the watch industry. I've noticed that on some of my older videos, people have commented asking for certain definitions or just asking for just explanations on certain terms. So what I've decided to do is make an all-in-one video putting you up to speed on everything you need to know when you start getting into watch collecting. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pull up an Omega Seamaster 300 Professional. This is from my review on the watch, which you can check in the link down below. Beautiful, beautiful watch. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through the watch, every single part. We're going to name every single part and basically any pertinent information that you're going to want to know, just being a watch collector in general. And hopefully that'll set you up on the right track, just to know sort of what to look for and what everything is, and just basically know your way around a watch. And by the way, if you're wondering, I'm just looking at the watch here on my phone. It's not the most complicated watch. When I say complicated, I mean it doesn't have like all the extra features that you do find on some watches. I am going to be covering them very basically, just so you have a basic understanding. But this is just a dive watch, which is obviously meant for diving. And I'm going to sort of explain what comes in a dive watch and what you can find on sort of other watches like GMTs or chronographs or whatever. Okay, so starting with the dial. So this is usually what stands out first to you. The dial is usually a textured sort of pattern. If you look on this one, we can see it's actually laser etched, which is very cool. And this is usually the party piece of the watch. They can be made from all sorts of materials, anything from sort of linen, like in the older Rolexes and Tudors, to sort of ceramic, like in more modern watches by Omega, things like that. Sticking off the center of the dial, obviously you should know this. These are called the hands. Normally you're going to find an hour and a seconds hand. There are exceptions where you do find watches, like I just mentioned about the GMTs and the chronographs, where you find many more hands and they each have their own function. So an example is what we call a GMT watch. And I'm just going to explain to you what that is, because that term is tossed around a lot and they're a very popular kind of watch as well. In super brief terms, GMT stands for Greenwich Mean Time, which is literally referring to the time in Greenwich, England. This is known as the International Dateline. It's basically where the world has sort of unanimously decided that the standard for time, the reference point basically for time, has been set to. So essentially anywhere west of Greenwich, you'll see gradually we're going to be increasing behind GMT, which is where you see the GMT -1, -2, -3. For example, if I'm in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, I'm in the GMT -3 zone, meaning I'm 3 hours behind Greenwich Mean Time. So basically by having a fourth hand on my watch, I can actually track that time zone, and I essentially have a watch that works amazing for travel. Anyway, back to hands. So there's many styles of hands. You have Breguet hands, Alpha hands, Mercedes hands, the list goes on and on. Each hand is going to offer their own unique sort of style and legibility that comes with that style of hand. Typically, dress watches will tend to err towards a certain style. Sports watches will tend to err towards sort of like bigger, more legible styles of hands. Now, speaking of hands, what the hands point to is the indices. Now, much like the hands, they each offer their own advantage in terms of style and legibility. The most common ones that you should know are Arabic numerals, which are basically the original numbers that you know today. They're called that because they're originally introduced by Arab merchants, I believe, and I believe they have sort of like a Hindu/Arabic origin, but I'm not 100% sure. You'll find these mostly on sort of sports watches, just out of the fact that they're very legible, very easy to read. Roman numerals, which you'll find usually on dressier watches. And then basic stick indices, or sometimes they're called baton indices, whatever you want to call them. They're, again, a more dressy style of indice. Okay, so all this is wrapped into what's called the case of the watch, and this is obviously the housing. They're normally made from steel, but they can also be made from precious metal. When it comes to the case, the most important thing you're going to want to take note of is the diameter. Something around a 36 or 38 millimeter will be a little bit smaller, a little bit classier, and generally will be more dressier. You can find dress watches / sports watches in the 38 to 40 millimeter range. Anything sort of 40 millimeters to 42 millimeters is generally sports watch, and 42 millimeters and above, you'll basically never find a dress watch at that size. They're all tool watches, things like pilot's watches, chronographs, things like that. Okay, so what are the pieces of metal that actually stick out of the case? Well, those are known as the lugs. Now, when we speak of lugs, generally there's something known as the lug to lug width that you're going to want to pay attention to. That's basically the actual measurement between one lug to the other. The reason that's important to be familiar with, guys, is because that's going to represent how much actual real estate that watch, I almost dropped my phone, that watch is going to take up on your wrist. So you're going to start to, just by trial and error, as you try on different watches, you're going to start to know what lug to lug width works for you. You can, for example, get a watch where the case size is what you're looking for, but the lug to lug width may be way too large. And so the watch is what we call wears larger. That's usually what that refers to. If you hear that term tossed around, wears large or wears small, usually it refers to the watch physically not taking that much space width-wise on your wrist, even if the case size might be appropriate for you or what you're looking for. And we're moving on to the bezel. Bezels are gonna typically offer different functionality depending on the functionality of the watch itself. In the case of this Omega Seamaster, this is what we call a dive bezel, and it actually rotates. So basically the way it works is you're gonna take your bezel, you're going to twist it to your minute hand, and then as your minute hand sort of moves away as time passes by, you're going to know how much time has passed by since you started tracking. We refer to this as elapsed time. That's just one function of a dive bezel. And something like a GMT, you're going to use that more so to track time zones. And typically GMT watches, the bezels are bi-directional. So that unlike a dive watch where it's usually only turns one direction, it'll turn both. Now, the reason for that is you can track multiple time zones. So if you know that, let's say the location you're in versus the location you want to track is a 3-hour difference, you can turn it 3 clicks and basically now read the time in the other time zone. So it's a very quick way, awesome way to just swap between time zones, and especially having a fourth hand helps a lot. Some watches obviously have basically, it's just basic plain steel bezels. Typically those are dress watches. You're not really gonna have any functionality out of that bezel, obviously. All right, now if you look at the edge of the watch, sort of at the 3 o'clock, maybe even 4 o'clock position, sometimes you're gonna see a little sort of twisty thing sticking out. You've definitely set a watch before, you've turned it before, you've used them before. This is called a crown. Now a crown, like I said, is used to set the time. What it does is it actually is able to be pulled out, and then the time or the date will be set depending on what your watch can do. And sometimes you'll notice that around the crown, there's 2 slabs of metal. Those are known as crown guards. They're supposed to be there to protect the crown so it doesn't break off, because if that happens, it's a pretty big issue. However, with today's sort of solid construction being standard in watches, if your crown is able to be removed by an impact, there's a good chance your fingers or your hand has come off as well, so you probably have bigger problems. Okay, moving on. So what do we actually look through when we look in a watch? We refer to this as the crystal. It's just a piece of glass. Some people call it the glass. That is basically what it is. Now, when it comes to crystals, you really only need to know 2 basic materials. There's acrylic, which is more plastic, and then there's sapphire. Those are generally the 2 options you'll find when you look into sort of specific brands like Seiko. They have their own proprietary types of crystals offering their own advantages, but I'm going to explain the difference between acrylic and sapphire. So acrylic is much softer, scratches much more easily. It's actually more flexible, believe it or not. So you can actually flex that a lot more before it'll snap than a sapphire. So you would think that you would want to avoid an acrylic out of the fact that it's soft and just cheap and easy to scratch. But however, they offer one very distinct advantage that you're not going to find in a sapphire crystal. They are very, very, very sort of warm and classically looking. They distort the dial underneath just because of their nice curvature. It's nice, smooth, even curvature. And so you get a very nice vintage aesthetic on the dial underneath. Some people like it. I like it very, very much. So it is actually possible to want to opt for an acrylic crystal. And the advantage as well is they're very cheap to replace, and it's very easy to get scuffs out. I have a video actually in the description. I'll leave it down below on how to actually remove scratches from an acrylic crystal using a product called Polywatch. Super cheap, super easy, takes 5 minutes. Now, the other option is a sapphire. Now, sapphire is going to be much more scratch resistant. It's much harder, but it's also much more brittle, which means it's much more susceptible to snapping from flex. Most sports watches will have a sapphire crystal. I tend to not buy sports watches if they don't have a sapphire crystal, and they are amazingly durable. They're awesome, but they don't offer that nice sort of domed, beautifully warm look. They're a much cooler tone. They just don't dome as well. They don't look as vintage. They look sort of like, they give the watch maybe like a cooler, more modern feel, if that makes any sense. Okay, so that basically covers all the important parts of the watch. You should be well on your way now to being able to sort of find your way around a watch. There's one thing left though, and it's very important. It's called the movement. Now, movement is basically what's inside the watch and actually tracks the time for you. I'm going to make this explanation very brief. They can get very, very, very complicated. There's basically two kinds of movements. There's quartz and there's mechanical. Quartz is gonna be your cheap, crappy, battery-powered, very unappealing movement you're gonna find in probably like 90% of watches these days. Most fashion watches are quartz. They're very unattractive, very unappealing. There's really no charm to a quartz watch. They're very cheap. There are exceptions to that. There are some actually very sophisticated quartz models, but we're not going to talk about that just now. Now, on the other side, mechanical. This is what you're going to want to go for when collecting watches. You're going to get the most variety and the most charm out of your watch. One big difference as well between the two is when on a quartz, the seconds hand will actually tick, and on an automatic, the seconds hand will sweep, which is obviously much more romantic. Just gives you an indication that there's actual craftsmanship underneath your dial. Now, mechanical is divided into two parts. You have your automatic, meaning the watch is automatically charged by movement. Usually that involves some kind of a rotor that'll spin around, and that's what actually winds up the watch. The other kind is a manual wind, where now the rotor doesn't exist and you basically have to wind the watch up yourself, kind of like an old school alarm clock. And you know, it's an extra step. You know, typically you'll just wind them at the beginning of your day and you'll go on, and then, you know, it'll drain its power reserve throughout the day, and then you just wind it again, you know, the next day. And that's basically it. Okay, so the case back, this is the back side of the watch. Usually on sports watches, it's just basic steel. Sometimes you do get what's called exhibition casebacks or display casebacks. These are very good looking. Usually it gives you an insight to the movement that's inside, and it's just another crystal basically on the back side of the watch. Very pretty looking. Some people will opt for it just out of the fact that you get to see the craftsmanship inside the watch. That was the crash course on everything you needed to know about watches, guys. If you're a beginner and this helped you out, please leave me a comment down below. Let me know how you liked the video. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe. Join the TWM army for your regular watch content. Until next time, I'll see you later and stay safe.